In this video, I'm going to walk through connecting an Agilent logic analyzer to one of my projects, specifically my 386DX build that I've been working on recently. In a previous video, I showed this little teensy-based analyzer that you see off to the right. And basically all I'm doing is I have some debug ports in my 386 board that I'm building. And I can connect in a little PCB I built that essentially shifts in 32 signals per PCB and then shifts them over to this teensy. So this teensy can acquire 128 signals from my 386 system. It formats the data, sends it over to my PC. My PC, then I have this Windows app that just shows the data, the waveforms, things like that. Pretty basic in its functionality, but I found it to be quite helpful. A limitation with this, though, is just speed. This really isn't designed to run at a megahertz type of system speed and be able to capture that information. It's just too fast. Works fine at the sub megahertz, maybe kilohertz is what I'm looking at. Right now, the Windows application, though, is kind of the bottleneck, the speed at which I draw these waveforms. And I have some ideas on things I can do to really speed that up. But the intention of this tool was to use it in a low-speed environment and see the waveforms as the system's running. So see how the data scroll by, see the waveforms, and use that for troubleshooting type of purposes. But if I want to go to something faster, what I'm going to take advantage of is this tool set. It's an Agilent logic analyzer. And specifically, this is a 1680A logic analyzer. It's kind of an all-in-one. It's basically a PC and an LCD and a logic capture device all in one chassis, all in one unit. And I picked up one of those for a pretty good price off of eBay. And then later I picked up a slightly different version, a 1680AD, which is essentially the same thing. It just has a little bit more memory. So when I go to capture, it can capture 4 times as much information into memory. And then I later picked up a 1690A. So I have a 1680A, a 1680AD, which is the deeper memory depth. And then I have a 1690A, which is just a standalone capture only. It doesn't have the PC, the LCD. It's intended to connect to a PC through a FireWire cable or IEEE 1394. So I have 3 of these devices I can play with, and realistically, the 2 that I'm liking the most is going to be the 1680AD because of the additional memory depth, and then the 1690A I'm really liking, and that's what I am going to use in this video here. Now, these logic analyzers all basically connect the same way. They have ribbon cables that connect into basically a capture device in whatever chassis you're using, the 1680A or the 1690. And they have a 60-pin high-density type of connector that connects into the chassis. And then on the other end, there is a pair of 40-pin connectors. And so that's what comes out of all these ribbon cables. And if you can see it on this picture on the left, it's labeled down on the bottom, pod 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have these 4 pod cables, and these cables go to the back of it, plug in with one of these high density 60 pins, and then it comes out and basically splits into a pair of these 40 pins. Now my goal would be to basically get that to plug right into my whatever system I'm trying to debug. And something like this would be a nice header to have just to plug that cable directly into. And that way I can connect up, grab all of the the 16 data lines, and there's also a clock line, so there's really 17 inputs per connector. So 17 times 8 is where you get your 136 for 136 inputs that this device can handle. Now, one thing, though, that you have to do, or I guess is suggested, and maybe you can go without this, but they do suggest onboard isolation network. And so maybe in my 386 build, I'd have to build on this isolation network or find a different way of doing it. I didn't want to build that into my 386. That just seemed like a lot. So for every signal I want to get over to the logic analyzer, I would need a pair of resistors and a capacitor. And that's too much just to add to my 386 build. Now, Agilent does talk about a surface mount package that puts in 8 of these. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, sorry, 6 of these. So it puts in 6 of these isolation networks into a package. I don't think you can get these anymore, so I don't have that. So instead, what I decided to do is on my 386, I put in some debug headers. And I'm using a little PCI Express X4 physical connector so that I can run 32 signals through that connector, so signals and a bunch of grounds. And then I built a little PCB that just will plug into that connector. And so this PCB here has the resistors, the capacitors. What you're going to see on the left, which this will be the top when I actually click it into the board, each of these pin headers I can connect directly to one of these cables. So I can come out of a pod connector in the back of the chassis. It comes out as 2 of these, which will plug into these 2 on this card. And this will just click right into my 386. And that will give me access to grab, all the signals out of that PCI Express connector, which is 32 signals. If you notice these headers, these are just simply headers that connect to the same signals off of the PCI Express. So either I can use them as quick test points to see what's coming through the PCI port, or I can disconnect this from the debug header on my 386 and just directly connect signals to these pins to get them through this isolation network over to the logic analyzer. Now the picture in the upper left again is a 1680. I'm going to be using a 1690, so it looks like this. Basically the connectors for these pods are up front, which I find actually more handy. So there's 4 of these up front, and then there's a little FireWire connector off to the right, and the intention is you would connect that to a PC with a FireWire, a card in it, or integrated onto the motherboard. But basically through FireWire, this is the 400 megabit FireWire, if I'm not mistaken, you would then get to be able to connect to the hardware in the 1690 chassis, and you would load up the logic analyzer software on that PC. And that's what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to actually get in and maybe walk through that so you can kind of see what that looks like. So real quick before I get too far, this is what my 386 looks like at this point. In the last video, I was using, again, these other little debug cards that went to the Teensy. I pulled those out real quick. I populated 4 of these Agilent custom probing boards you see down at the lower right. Basically, I'm just treating that as a signal acquisition type of a board. But with all of those isolation networks, I put in the top 2 pin headers, H1 and H2 on each of the boards, and then connected a pair of cables that go to the high density pod connector on the chassis of the logic analyzer. So for example, that right slot right here on the board underneath, there's a little PCI Express X4 connector, and that's just a physical connector, nothing to do with the actual PCI Express protocol. And then I have pods 6 and 5 connected, and then here I have 2 and 1. And then as I work my way, I get the rest of the pods connected in the same way. So 8, 7, 4, 3. So I get all 4 of these basically cards. Each is populated with 2 cables, and so that gives me all 8 what are considered pods that go back and connect to the chassis. And if I give you a little bit more background on my messy desktop, but this is how I'm set up, is underneath then my workbench, I have a little toolbox, and on that toolbox I have my power supply that I use, and I just run banana cables right into my system right up here. And then I just have this 1690A sitting just off to the right, which is perfect. It's out of the way. When I'm not working on it, I can take these cables and just set them on top of the 1690 chassis, and I have a clear workbench. And when I do want them, I just pull them out. So it takes up really no workbench space, and it actually fit pretty well in this little space down here. And then you can see the cables going up, and this is where they're connecting to those 4 cards. Here's the top view off to the left. And here's a little bit better view of this chassis. Now I want to point out, this is typically where you would connect the FireWire connector. Now I bought this unit for a really good price. It was not working. What I did though is internally within the chassis, as I was troubleshooting this, I found out that this connector was broken, and I didn't want to try to source a connector or mess with surface mount soldering, replacing the connector, because internally there's 2 additional connectors. So previously I had a post where I just showed I connected to one of those internal connectors and just ran the firewire cable out the back of this chassis. Put a small hole in the back with a grommet and basically a cable strain relief, so that that cable is locked in there and I don't have to worry about pulling on it. But it then goes over to a PC that I have sitting off to the right, and it's just a little utility PC that I then connect to that firewire. I put a little firewire card in it. So I'm connecting to the back of the chassis. That's why you don't see this connection up front actually connected, for those of you that are used to using this 1690 device. So that's the setup, and right now I'm going to flip over and actually remote in to that little utility PC that is connected to the 1690. So I'm going to escape out of this and get over to that desktop. So here is my PC. This is this little utility PC I was talking about. Maybe a couple things to note real quick. I am running Windows 10 on this. So here you can see I'm running Windows 10. You can see the version information. Basically, you need to get an operating system up and running and then load up this Agilent software, which I'm going to open in a minute. Now, I've seen a lot of posts about, can you run a newer operating system than Windows XP, which is probably what was used when this software first came out that I'm going to use. And you definitely can. I'm running Windows 10. I would maybe point out just a little bit here on that. If things are working correctly, if you have a FireWire card that is supported by the logic analyzer, it should show up under logic analyzers, and then here you can see this PC is detecting an Agilent 1680/1690, and that would be connected through a FireWire controller, which here is my FireWire controller. And I do have this as a, it says legacy FireWire controller. I have a blog post on this. You can go check out my blog. There's a post specifically for this Agilent type of stuff I'm doing. And I have details on, kind of my setup, but it's basically Windows 10. There's certain FireWire host controllers that I'm finding work, and there are some that don't. And I think that the general trend is that Texas Instruments chipset-based ones are working fine, others are not. So make sure you get a good FireWire controller if you're going to try to have a newer operating system. That seems to be a challenge. And with that, you then have to use a driver that's called a legacy driver. And I have details in that blog post on how to get all those drivers set up. But this looks good. I see it says Logic Analyzer. It shows my Logic Analyzer. I also have a little icon down here, this little green icon. And this is part of the installation of the Logic Analyzer software, which you can download off of the vendor's website for free. So again, I have a link to that in my blog post. But when you connect that Logic Analyzer, in my case a 1690, through the FireWire cable, this should turn green ultimately. It'll first turn yellow. It's trying to initialize it. So if it doesn't detect it, there'll be no little circle down here, no icon at all. But once it detects it, it should turn yellow. It'll try to then initialize it, and if it succeeds, it'll turn green. So if things are working correctly, there should be this little green icon down here. But then I can go ahead and run the software, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. So here's this Agilent Logic and Protocol Analyzer. So as it connects here, the first thing the system comes up with when I run the software is an overview, and then there's 2 additional sheets I can flip to. There's one to let me view waveforms once I start capturing, and there's also a listing version, which will just list out at what point did it capture something and what were the values. But probably the first thing I have to do is determine, which specific pods are used for which signals. Where's my address data? Where's my data from the bus, my 32-bit data bus, or other control signals? And so I can come in here, and there's a bus signal setup, and I can come into the bus signal setup and say, okay, I'm going to use these first 2 pods for my address data. So that little capture or that little signal acquisition card that I plugged into my 386, I routed all of the address pins through that one little PCI Express connector. And so I'm going to come in here and say this is my address, ADDR. And so that name, and then these are the signals in this order. So pod 2, 15 down to 0 are going to be my highest word for my address. Pod 1 then will be my low word for my address. So that'll give me my 4 bytes or 32-bit address. And then I might also come in here and say, well, I'd like to add in a clock signal. And so I could say, well, let's add clock. And then I choose clock and I can say OK. And then my clock, I can choose where to pick it up. And now each of these little acquisition boards I built does have a jumper, and I can pick off of clock 2 or clock on my 386 on which one it feeds over. And I can read those independently over here. And so clock 2 I have configured currently to be coming in, oops, right here. And so that's actually clock 2. So I might rename this to clock 2. And it's just showing up and down, meaning that signal should be changing right now. You can see some of these others are showing, that it's seeing some changes. Some of the stuff maybe is moving fast enough. It just shows it's changing a lot. You don't see an up or down like you do on some of these, like high or low. If you see the up down, it just means it's moving fast enough. It's not at one specific spot. I'm going to go ahead and say OK though. And then I can see over here I have my clock. And I can resort these. I'm going to put the time. It'll show me a little dot when it captures. It'll show me the value of the clock and the value of the address. And I can also open that up and see all the individual bit values. Now, when I look at this, that's setting up my address bus. It's setting up where my clock is coming from. There's also sampling. I can tell it, do I want to sample things asynchronously? In other words, just on a heartbeat, every 2.5 nanoseconds, just grab the values. Or I can do something called synchronous, where I maybe synchronize it to the clock of my 386. I'm going to start out with this asynchronous sampling. And when I do that, every time it samples, there's a certain amount of data I can capture, and that goes from 4K up to 512. This is where the AD version of the logic analyzers give you up to 2 meg. So it's 4 times as much. You can go with a deeper capture depth or acquisition depth. But maybe I pick 512 for this for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and say OK on this. Then I can set up triggers, and the default trigger is just if anything happens. So in other words, when I run it, it's just going to start capturing right away, and that's fine. But then I've got a little play button, and I should be able to hit play or run, and then it fetched some data. And I can zoom out, I can zoom in, and so if I zoom out a ways, here's what it captured. And it captured, again, here's my clock 2 signal, and you can see it's capturing a lot for the speed of my clock. So there's a lot of data it captured. But I can see that at one point it was reading out an address value of E0014. And that's good because that's a value that I know is within the program that's running. It's basically looping through, reading a piece of memory, incrementing it, writing it back out, and then repeating the loop. And part of that code is in this address in my basically ROM data, which is E0014. So the low E's is where I copy ROM into RAM. So that's a RAM address, but it's really the program that got copied from ROM that is running. But that's good. I can see that. I can see, all the individual address bits. If I want, I can just collapse that. It's a lot simpler view. But then I can see at some point, then it transitioned to something else, and there's a whole lot of just changes happening on the address bus. And that's probably in between valid states. So there's probably a whole bunch of non-valid information here. And if I zoom in, I can then scroll to the right and really start looking at, what is happening, what is changing. Maybe I'm not expecting something to change, or it's changing too early or too late or something else. But this is capturing a lot of data. And I'm going to zoom back out. what I would then want to do is maybe add in data. So I see my address, E14, but what did it read when it was trying to read that address? So I could then go in back to my bus setup, and I'm going to add a bus, and this will be my data bus. And when I do my data bus, I'm going to say that the data bus is on these bits here, because through that connector and that little acquisition board, I have all of the data bits routed. And I'll say okay to that. And I want to see my time when it captured. I want to see the value of clock 2. I want to see the address, and then I want to see the data. Okay, that seems okay. So then I can go ahead and maybe I run this again and see what we capture. And there's a E10. There's 5AC. Now 5AC is a memory location low in RAM, and this read a 1C05. And so that's a spot where I'm trying to write back a value after I've incremented it. I'll then read it, increment it, write it. So we'll see this spot maybe show up a bunch, 5AC. But if I run this, I keep running this. Now it's at E0018 and it read something. Now we're back at maybe 5AC, but the data didn't quite look right. So let me just hit, I want to see if I can get back to another 5AC. And now we have a 1C50. So 1C50. So here's 1C63. So it's gone from 1C50 to 16C3 as I came around, and I'm just manually capturing here. So that just shows me it's incrementing what's in that RAM location at 5AC. This is giving me some confidence that my program seems to be working. Right now I'm running it at about 250 Hertz, so really slowly. But this is capturing, this is showing me what's going on. And then of course I can come over here and look at all of this other stuff. Now keep in mind that what really matters for the processor is when things are on the rise clock of CLK. So what I need to be looking at, or I should be looking at, is CLK. So I could come in here and say, well, let's go also add in CLK as a signal. And I know that I've got that coming in a different one of these cards. And CLK I should be pulling in right here. And so off of this first acquisition board, basically pod 1 and 2, I can pull CLK the way I've got it configured. But now I can look at that and I can see here is CLK. I can maybe pull that up. And if I want, I of course can zoom into this and take a look. And really when this CLK is rising, that's probably what I want to be looking at, is something that's over here. But let me just zoom in a bit, and then I can kind of scroll my way over and start interrogating what's going on over here. Now, this is a little tricky to do it this way, in my opinion. Like here, I can see that that clock went up. This clock is still low. So clock 2 is up, but then clock is low. And I could scroll up. And of course, I could put a trigger in and say, well, when clock rises, that's when I want to pay attention to something. And then zoom into what happened when the clock CLK went from low to high. And let me see if I can scroll through this faster. I'm looking for CLK to go high. And I might not have that in that part of the capture. So let me back up further. And this is where that memory depth is nice. The more memory I've got, then I can have more of this captured versus a shorter capture. Okay, so here's a spot where CLK went high. And so then this would be valid according to the processor at this stage, most likely. There's other signals, though, we have to look at, but I'm at address 5AC, and then I can see that the data value was 1C64 when that rise happened. So that just starts to help me understand what's going on. Now, something else I can do is, of course, add all the other signals. So I've got all these other signals. So I've added in my address and data. These other 64 bits are for miscellaneous control signals like RAM write, RAM read, ROM read, etc. I might also look at how I'm acquiring, and instead of acquiring on just this every 2.5 nanoseconds, just tell it I want to acquire specifically when clock goes high or clock 2. And maybe I'll start with clock 2. So if I back up, I can look at my signal acquisition and I can see that clock 2 is on basically this pin right here. And on the sampling, what I'm going to do is say that I want to come in here on, this is 4 is what I'm looking for. So clock 2 is on, according to the analyzer, it's 4th clock coming in. So that 4th clock coming in, I can come in here and say, I want anytime it changes, so whether it's going up or down, I want it to capture. So in pod 4 is where I'm bringing in clock 2, or sorry, in pod 3, I'm bringing in clock 2. Let's go double check that. No, I said pod 4. I've got this on the wrong one. Let me correct that. Both edges, don't care. Okay, so over here, I'm saying I'm grabbing clock 2 on this 4, and then for 4, if it is either rising or falling, wherever those edges are, that's when I actually want to do a capture of data. And this is a synchronous sampling, they call it. And then I can choose how much data. Well, now it's only going to capture when those edges are rising or falling. I'm going to capture a really small window to start, only 4K, because I don't need a lot when I'm only capturing at those points instead of every 2.5 nanoseconds. This will be much slower, especially at the speed at which I'm running the system right now. So I'm going to go ahead now and run this, and I see down below it's processing, it's running, and now it's waiting. So the trigger has happened, and the trigger right now is set up to trigger on anything. But then it finished that, and then it stopped. And the pause was, it was capturing data. So after the trigger happened, it was basically every time that my clock 2 went up or down, it was adding some data to its capture. And like, here's a raw listing of that. So I can see that it captured when the trigger happened, it captured information before the trigger and after the trigger. But from the trigger on, I can see it's going from address E10 to E14 to E18. Here I can see it's over looking at my RAM at 5AC, and I can see that the current counter stored in there is 1 ECB, and I can just follow through. Now, I know these values because I've looked at the code. I know the simple assembly code I wrote and what addresses it's at in ROM, so I recognize this. Now I could go over to my assembler and look at its, there's what's called a listing output, and it'll show me what it's doing at each address. And I could use that to kind of decipher this. I just happen to know this one is so simple that every time I see 5AC, that's this counter. So like if I looked up earlier, 5AC was at 1 ECB, and then I get down here further and we get 1 ECC. So then the next one I would expect to see is 1 ECD. The next time it does a write to it, at least it'll probably do a read from it first. So there's the read that it would have been doing, and I'm guessing, but I'm probably right on that. But then here's the 1 ECD. So it's writing a value, then later it reads it, increments it, writes it. But I can see that happening in this list. I can see that in the waveforms then. If I want to back out and zoom out a little bit. So now this looks much cleaner and easier to work with than it did before, because I'm only snagging or capturing data when clock 2 goes up or down. And this time, there'll be a little tick mark every time it captured data. So every little tick mark is a capture point. And then I can see, what did it capture for clock 2? What did it capture for clock? What does my address look like at that point? What does the data look like at that point? And again, I can compare, do all these waveforms line up the way I would expect they do? And for this build, I know I don't have this stuff all optimized yet. I've got a lot of timing work to do yet in my build, but I can go through and see that an address was placed out, and then there was data that was probably read at that point, or an address, and then data that was written, whatever it might be. This was probably the read, actually. It read the CB, and then it wrote a CC. And then if I go to the right, it probably reads a CC, and then it's going to write a CD. So again, I could kind of just work my way right and try to find those points in time. And so here's the reading probably of the CC, and then over to the right, then I'm going to eventually get to a CD that it should be writing. Anyways, if I want, I can expand these and look at the individual bits. Again, I can zoom out, I can zoom in. This would be that window that it filled its memory. And again, in my capture, I've told it that I'm going to capture 4K. If I would have said 512, it would run quite a while, of course, before it would stop, because it's got to basically let the program run and have enough of these data points, like you see over here, captured to fill up that full 512K. Now, as I speed up my clock 2 on my system, of course, it's going to fetch this data much, much faster and fill it up faster. But I'm running so slow right now, like 250 hertz, that it takes a lot to fill this up. So 4K is plenty. But then from here, I want to now get all the rest of my other signals. Now, I could go through and do that in the recording in kind of a painstaking way and have you watch me do that. I did already pre-configure that though. So if I want, I can just open up a pre-built configuration file. And when I load that up, I'll just go right into my setup of my bus and signals real quick. But what you're seeing here is I've got my clock and clock 2. I've got the address and data. That's what you saw me just go through and do. But then I've got all of these other control signals, and you can see that I'm going to this next pair, these 32 bits of control, and mapping those, giving them the appropriate names. And then if I go over to the next pair, that's the next 32-bit of signals, some of which I'm not using yet, so I just labeled them TBD. But these are all additional signals, either control signals or just like a pre-latch address. I might use that for some comparison of pre and post latching, that type of thing though. So I've got all these signals that I can now look at and kind of interrogate. Is it working the way I expect it to? And then over here, then of course you get that type of output. So in this case, maybe I took my what I notice sometimes, at least, I'm remoted in, I'm doing a remote connection to this PC right now. Sometimes when I scroll up and down, these two don't scroll in sync. But I'm starting out with my time up top. So anytime you see a dot, it snapped that data. And then I've got clock 2, I've got clock. Here's my reset. That should always be low unless I'm actively resetting. I got my MIO, DC, etc. I work all my way down. Here's all my ROM writes. So there's a general ROM write signal, and then I've got for each of my, RAM write, and then for each of my RAM chips I can tell, and in a previous video I pointed that out, like here it's writing to all 4 RAM chips at once. If I scroll to the right, here it's only writing to 2 of the RAM chips. So it only wrote a word instead of, it wrote 16 bits of data to RAM instead of 32 bits. And that would have been based on whatever my code was telling it to do. I formatted the address to be yellow. You can do all kinds of formatting in here that I'm learning how to do. But this is letting me now kind of interrogate, what am I seeing? I can look at the listing version of it. So up top, I've got all my column headers, and I can see, here's a capture point, capture point 31. I can see what point that was within the capture, and then I can really look through all of the data that goes with that. And again, this is just a listing version, and this would have filled up whatever that memory was that I was working with at the time, 4K or 512K or whatever it might have been. This was probably only 4K in this example. But that's essentially what I'm doing in this tool. And like I said, I'm new to this, but I found this software pretty intuitive. Regular keyboard shortcuts I would expect to use in Windows all seem to work in here. So it seems like it's pretty easy to use this. I can see as it's sitting here, it's showing me changes that are happening on some of these signals. If I want to reacquire, then I would just go run this again. Now in this case, if I go into how I'm acquiring, again, I'm doing it based on this clock. So I'm saying if that clock, and clock 3 and 4 are identical, 1 and 2 are identical. So whether I did 4 or 3, it really doesn't matter, I guess. But this is saying capture 4K of data if this clock signal, which in my case was clock 2, either moves up or moves down. And I did it for all of these signals. And, this is now work I have to do, especially as I start picking up the speed. I know the system runs fine at the fastest speed I can run with my little 555 timer, which is about 250 hertz right now. Because I run out of a 555, I go through a flip-flop. So it really cuts in half whatever that 555 was configured to output. My next step, though, is to go to an actual oscillator and pick up the speed and get into the kilohertz and megahertz. But as I go, I kind of got to see, where do I have timing issues? Where do I have things that just aren't right? And so I have a lot of work to do there. But this tool will let me start to test and understand things at higher speeds versus at the slow speed, the sub-kilohertz speed. So that's probably the biggest part of this. Maybe something I haven't gotten into would be like triggers. So if I want, I can go in and set up triggers. And actually it's right now it's set up for an advanced trigger. But I could come in here and, tell it, when does it start recording? And this one, the last time I was working with it here earlier today, I just said, check for address when it gets to E0010. Or I could say, well, go to that specific memory address when I know it's writing to RAM, that counter value. And I could say, look for that address. But this here just says, don't start recording until you see this address come across, then start recording. And there's all of this I can build logic that, look for this, look for that, look for combinations, do something. That's all stuff I need to figure out how to work with more. It seems fairly intuitive, though, this part of it. And I did notice you can even write Visual Basic for applications so that you can extend functionality in this tool with whatever you want to do from VBA, which might be interesting. And I might take advantage of that at some point. So that's probably the highlight of where I'm at with this for now. So if I back up, I have a board I'm working on. It happens to be a 386. I put in these little debug ports. Each port lets me capture 32 signals plus a clock that I can use for reference, like I've done in here. And then once I plugged in those 4 acquisition boards into my 386, that was giving me my 128 plus my clock 2 and clock that I'm pulling in. I then came in and I created my buses, or just individual addresses, or full bus or just individual signals, and then I mapped it to what are those. So here's my address, here's my data, here's all these other individual signals that I want to show. I can choose then how I want to do acquisition, and it seems like synchronous sampling makes the most sense for the stuff I'm working on for now. But later when I'm troubleshooting timing issues, this asynchronous is probably going to be helpful. It's going to let me see if something happened outside of the rise or fall of an edge of a clock, that something was happening, something was delayed or whatever it might be. You can also say that when a trigger happens, does it keep the data before, after the trigger? So like this would say, when the trigger happens, fill the memory starting from that point going forward for 4K. This here would say trigger, but save the previous 4K of data. So obviously it's got a FIFO or something that it's internally using, so that as all this data is running, it's keeping track of when the trigger happens. It then says grab the most recent 4K of data, and that's what I want to then show. Or you can place this wherever you want. Maybe you want half of the data prior to the trigger, half the data after the trigger. But then once I get done with that, then it's really set up triggers. And in this case, maybe here's an example where I'm not going to trigger until I see a certain address on the address bus. And when that happens, it's then going to go ahead and capture data until that 4K buffer is full. Or I go back and I say increase it from 4K to a larger number, 512 for this one, or if I switched over to my 1680 AD, I could go to 2 meg, which would be a lot to look through. But that's good. That lets me maybe run for a longer period and really try to track what's going on better. I know there are also tools to do decoding of this, and I have not gotten into that yet. So, for example, there is a packet decoder, and I can then choose which type of decoding do I want to do. And all of this stuff is well beyond my capability. I'm not going to be generating HDMI signals or PCI Express signals. I think there's SPI. That's probably the first one in this list that I would try to use is, can I decode SPI? I can also get in and put in options so that when it sees certain things, like I could say every time it sees that address of my RAM that it was writing that value to, so 1416 or 1418, let's see, okay, so here I'm at 5AC, and at that point the counter value was a 42. I could say that every time it sees this, don't show this, but show something in place of that. So I think they have a way to come in and set up, let's see if I can find it here, symbols. And so then I can come in and say, well, on the address, I want to add a symbol, and might say RAM counter location, and then I could tell it look for 05AC, and when it sees that, okay, so I had a real quick pop over to the help file. But what I did is if I go to symbols, I can go into address and I can add in all the values like 5AC. I could say, well, that's my RAM counter location. Or I could add a symbol that says this is my program start. And I don't remember exactly which value that was at, but it was at an E something. So I'll just pick 8. I know it was in there. It's probably something before that. And I say okay. But then I had to go over to the address and change the base. So instead of saying show it as hex, I said show it as symbols. So now what I should see is that anytime it finds that E address with the 8, that's my program start, and it would call it out. So right there's my program start. And then it got to this point, and there's my RAM location read and write. So that just helps me quickly identify as I go through this. And maybe let's see if I even shrink it down one more. You know, here I've got a program start. If that really was my start address, I could actually back up though and tell there's a 1410. Yeah, so maybe it is pretty close to 8 is where my program is looping back to. But then I've got my program start. I'm doing something with RAM. I'm doing something with RAM. I'm doing something with RAM. Program start. So basically, I think the way my program is this is my program starting. It's going to read the RAM, write the RAM, read the RAM, and then we get back to program start again or something close to that. But that lets me kind of put in these friendly labels, and that's kind of a way to build my own decoding as I get into this. Or if I start having other things I'm looking for, I can add all of those, and I'm assuming I can probably also colorize things a certain way, but that just helps me quickly pick out where's my program starting, where's the RAM address, where's there something else going on. I could even do decoding on the data and look for, I suppose, opcodes, things like that, and have it actually show which opcodes are being read or used by the CPU. So I think there's quite a bit here that I need to learn how to play with, learn how to work with, and see what I can get out of this. But so far I'm liking this. It's even though this is an old, I don't know what the last update was, maybe 2015. So it's pretty old, and the software, of course, has been around much longer than that. But seems to be a pretty good piece of software. So. Okay, I'm going to stop there. If you've got questions, comments, suggestions, if you know a lot about this tool set and have any tips or pointers for others watching this, feel free to drop a note below. And you'll probably see me using this tool periodically now as I do work on future projects, starting with this 386 system, just to kind of get some troubleshooting skill using this tool.